All right. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. As you're coming into the room, if you could just make sure that you are muted. I believe everybody should be muted. We're going to give just another couple minutes here for people to get logged in. And if you're interested, you can find closed captioning on your Zoom screen using the slide that you see now. But welcome, everyone. Just another 30 seconds or so. And I believe you should all be able to use the chat box if you're interested in introducing yourself, including pronouns or any organizations you're with. Feel free to use the chat box to go ahead and do that. Welcome again. Okay. We are going to go ahead and get started. I'm sure more people will be joining us as we get going here. We are here for September's Honesty Lunch and Learn. We're going to be talking about appeals and beyond, an overview of Ohio's court system and gender-affirming care for trans youth. I am Christina Collins, Executive Director of Honesty for Ohio Education. I use she, her pronouns. Very excited to be here today for this topic. Honesty is a coalition of 70 organizations working across the state to convene, educate, and activate individuals and communities to protect honest and inclusive education, building a more representative democracy for every Ohioan. As I mentioned, we're a coalition, 70 organizations, and we work at the State House, across state agencies, the Department of Education and Workforce, and the State Board of Education. And we also work at the local school level. If you haven't, I encourage you to go to our website to check out the many, many resources that we have available there. It is honestyforohioeducation.org. On the next slide, we have our agenda for today. So we're going to do some really quick honesty updates. And then we're going to be hearing from Sean McCann with ACLU of Ohio and Catherine Turcer with Common Cause Ohio. Then we'll finish up with some questions and some events that Honesty has coming up. So honesty updates, we are still in summer recess for the State House until November. But importantly, new bills are still being introduced. So I encourage you to sign up for our newsletter so that you are getting updates on these new education bills and any additional information that's coming out about bills that we anticipate to be moving during Ohio's lame duck session, which is November and December of this year. Important note, the deadline to register to vote is October 7th. Make sure your voter registration was not purged. And we have endorsed voting yes on issue 1. That is the ballot issue to end gerrymandering in Ohio. So we encourage you to vote yes on that issue. Honesty also recently released our brand new RTRI toolkit. This is release time for religious instruction. You've been hearing, I'm sure, about LifeWise across the state. This toolkit helps educate people on what LifeWise is, what religious release time is, and ways that you can identify whether or not your local school district has a policy, how you can advocate at the State House level, as well as at your local school district level and with your community. We've outlined myriad issues that are problematic about LifeWise's version of the RTRI program, and provided, again, a lot of resources, model policies that you can use. So I encourage you to check that out for sure. And finally, the next State Board of Education meeting is on September 9th at 9 a.m. So with that, those very, very brief updates, we are going to move into our topic for today, which again is an overview of Ohio's court systems and gender-affirming care for trans youth. We're going to hear from 2 speakers. I'm going to go ahead and introduce both of the speakers, and then we will hear from Sean first and then Catherine second. So Sean McCann serves as a policy strategist for the ACLU of Ohio in the Columbus office. Ever since Sean learned what the ACLU was and what it stood for, working for Ohio's state affiliate has been a personal goal of his. He is proud to stand with this historical institution in its relentless, unequivocal pursuit of equal justice for all. Sean works with colleagues cross-departmentally, coalition partners, community organizations, and elected officials to enact the ACLU's policy agenda with a particular focus on death penalty abolition and LGBTQ+ rights advocacy. Both issues have great personal significance to him. Our second speaker is Catherine Turcer. Catherine is the executive director of Common Cause Ohio, a grassroots organization devoted to open and accountable government. As a public interest lobbyist, Catherine promotes access to the ballot and open government at the State House. Catherine serves on the steering committee for the following organizations: the Ohio Fair Courts Alliance, the Ohio Voter Rights Coalition, and Fair Districts Ohio. Prior to her tenure at Common Cause Ohio, Catherine ran Ohio Citizen Action's Money in Politics program. So we are very excited to have both of these speakers today, and we will be kicking off with Sean.
Thanks so much, Christina. And hey, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time on a Friday afternoon to hear about an equally heavy and also definitely complicated topic. I was just saying to one of my friends the other day that I think, but like Christina said in kind of my bio, I did come from the Ohio State House, worked there for 3 years, and I think until I started at the ACLU of Ohio, I didn't fully understand like the difference between state and federal courts, what kind of the path of a lawsuit looks like through either kind of path, frankly, and like the judges that we have in our ballot. So all of that to say that this is complicated stuff that even those of us who are plugged into the work and engaged don't know everything about. And I know far from far from everything, not even that much. But I have learned a lot since starting at the ACLU of Ohio 2.5 years ago. So for a little bit of background, as I think many folks in the room know, we are currently litigating against, we are challenging the constitutionality of Ohio House Bill 68, which, again, as I'm sure most folks know, is the kind of the combination ban on gender-affirming care for transgender and gender non-conforming youth. As well as the ban on young transgender girls and women playing high school and college sports on girls and women's teams. So we filed that lawsuit a few months back, and we're able to well, I'll go into kind of the different steps that of the litigation, but just kind of wanted to provide that quick background of what the law actually is. And we filed our challenge to HB 68 in state court, and today we're going to be talking about state courts because we felt that there were some really compelling. Our legal team, I should say, I'm not by further way background, not an attorney, so I'm just kind of I am speaking from my knowledge as a policy advocate, as a in my kind of advocacy lane. But we felt that there were very compelling reasons to file our lawsuit in state court as opposed to federal court, because there are a couple of unique things in the Ohio Constitution that, especially in the case of one provision of the Ohio Constitution, is very, very unique. I think only one other state has a similar provision. So the first one is the Ohio Constitution single subject rule, which I'm sure many are familiar with, that holds that a law can only be germane to a single subject. So when you get into the business of combining different topics, different subjects into one law, which, as we know, the legislature does pretty frequently to varying degrees of egregiousness, that's when you start to run afoul of that, at least potentially run afoul of the Constitution single subject rule. So we, in our lawsuit challenging HB 68, we strongly believe, and we have argued, that HB 68 does violate Ohio's single subject rule because it very clearly combines two things that are entirely unrelated: participation in elementary and high school and collegiate athletics, and access to healthcare. Certainly the legislature would say, and we think this is callous and harmful and just kind of outright despicable, that the connective tissue here is trans youth. The legislature feels it has the ability to regulate trans youth's participation in sports and their healthcare. Again, two totally different topics, and in any other, in any other context, looking at participation in sports and access to healthcare, just that on its face, those are not two related topics. Um, the other provision of the Constitution, again, this is the one that's super unique to Ohio, and I believe only one other state has a similar provision, and it's never really been tested in litigation, as I understand it from our legal team, is Ohio's healthcare amendment, which, as some might know, the legislature kind of ironically uh, put on the ballot and voters then approved about, I think, gosh, 10 to 12 years or so ago now. This healthcare amendment was intended to actually undercut the Affordable Care Act, and basically it ensures that Ohioans have the freedom to purchase their own healthcare, free from any burden or restraint from government. So now we've had the unique opportunity to again test this provision of the Constitution, this amendment to the Constitution approved by voters for the first time in this way, to say that, hey, this amendment clearly says that Ohioans should be able to pursue their own healthcare without intervention from the government. Sure looks like the government is trying to intervene in what type of healthcare Ohioans can pursue via HB 68, via the healthcare ban in HB 68. So those were, the two claims that, again, made it very compelling to file our lawsuit in, whoa, the sun really just disappeared there. To file our lawsuit in state court as opposed to federal court. And then in addition, we've got a couple other claims that are very similar to litigation that you might see in federal courts. We pursued a claim under the Ohio Constitution's equal protection provision, very similar to the federal Constitution's, equal protection rights, and then a due process claim as well, arguing that particularly here, parents' due process rights to pursue their own children's healthcare and to direct the care of their children is being violated here. And again, it's similar to the federal Constitution's due process protections. So all of that being said, of course, we started at the trial court level, and Catherine, I'm sure we'll go into this more. The kind of three tiers of the judiciary that we have. It's similar to the federal judiciary. We've got our state trial courts, our state appellate courts, and then the Ohio Supreme Court. So this lawsuit, like any other, starts with the trial court, and in this case, we filed our case in the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas. And we made all these arguments. And that the case was assigned to Judge Michael Holbrook of the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas. And, over the course of so I should back up. First, we pursued what is called a temporary restraining order to, while the case was playing out, to make sure that the harms of this law were prevented, that this law did not take effect and immediately, deprive trans youth of their ability to pursue their own healthcare, as well as the athletics provisions of HB 68, though our lawsuit specifically was focused on the healthcare ban. And Judge Holbrook actually found that we would be likely to succeed on our single subject claim. Again, the claim that these two things are not common, are not germane to a single subject, that they violate the single subject rule. So he did put into place and extended multiple times while the case kind of played out procedurally, a temporary restraining order that just a few days before HB 68 would have taken effect, prevented it from taking effect. So then we maintained the status quo. Youth are still able to get their care. Youth are still able to play sports, while the case plays out. Unfortunately, what happened, gosh, I can't remember the date now off the top of my head, but a month or so ago, was that Judge Holbrook, after a really rigorous 5-day trial, a historic 5-day trial, where we the ACLU of Ohio, along with ACLU National and a law firm called Goodwin Proctor, presented our arguments, our witnesses, and then the state presented their own arguments, their own witnesses. Judge Holbrook unfortunately reversed himself on the single subject rule claim, and found that apparently it is permissible to regulate transgender, the commonality being transgender people. The legislature can regulate transgender people in these two very distinct and different ways. He also did not agree with any of our other three claims. So he then, in kind of one fell swoop, after that 5-day trial, allowed HB 68 to take effect and removed the temporary restraining order, preventing it from taking effect. So we immediately appealed. And like I said, three-tiered system. The next step would be to appeal to the state appellate court in our area, which in this case is the 10th District Court of Appeals, one of 12 appellate courts in the state. And the appellate court's role is really to review decisions made by trial courts, like the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas, in this case, their role is going to be to review Judge Holbrook's decision and to consider the briefs submitted by our legal team and by the state's legal team. We, in addition to immediately appealing Judge Holbrook's decision, also have asked the 10th District to restore the injunction against this law to bring us back to that status quo where, care is still legal, where, where folks can still play sports on the team that aligns with their gender. So where we stand now is that a randomly chosen 3-judge panel, which like in any case, when a case reaches the appellate court, a 3-judge panel of that court is randomly chosen to consider the case. This randomly chosen 3-judge panel is going to hear oral argument on the case from our team and the state's team actually next Wednesday, September 11th at 1:30 p.m. Just to kind of hone in more on what the appellate court will be doing, this is very different from the trial on the merits. And actually, Sam just shared in the chat a really good info sheet that kind of walks through what appellate courts do. This is the court is just hearing oral argument from our team and the state's team, as opposed to hearing a full trial on the merits, like the 5-day trial that Judge Holbrook heard, where really, we brought experts, again, all these different things to bear to demonstrate why we feel the law is unconstitutional. In this case, oral arguments will last 45 minutes for each side, and then the appellate court will consider and make a decision as to whether, again, like reviewing Judge Holbrook's decision and also reviewing our request for the injunction to be put back into place against the law. So, I see Sam also put in the chat that oral argument is open to the public at the Franklin County Courthouse, courtroom 23B. It will also be live streamed at that YouTube link. Important to note, it will not be recorded and archived. So, if you can't watch, if you can't make it in person, which obviously, folks are not expected to all kind of, that's a burden in the middle of the workday. If you can't watch on YouTube, there will be news coverage. Certainly, reporters are in the courtroom taking down what's going on. Our team will be providing updates during that day. And then, as we wait for a decision from the appellate court, we'll be getting information out to the community, to the public. So that's kind of the state of play with the lawsuit specifically. And certainly the only other thing to note about kind of the path of the lawsuit through the courts is that no matter what decision the 10th District renders, we know that ultimately, if we are successful, the state will appeal, almost certainly. And if unfortunately, if the opposite proves true, we would very likely seek to appeal that decision. You can't say until these things happen, but the fact of the matter is that this case will likely end up before the Ohio Supreme Court. And again, in our 3-tiered system, they are the final arbiter on questions arising under the Ohio Constitution. They also, they field other cases, certainly, but just kind of, since we're here to talk about this lawsuit and in our state courts, they make the final decision on questions under the Ohio Constitution. So whatever the decision here from the appellate court, we're going to keep fighting in the Ohio Supreme Court. And, certainly any other way that we can support the community, we will be doing so outside of this case, through our coalition work, through our state house advocacy, through other litigation that may in the future arise through our organizing. So you might be asking, though, in the context of this case, and this is something that certainly Catherine will touch on in much more detail than I possibly could hope to do. what does all this mean in the context of what's on our ballot this November? And how do we, what influence do we have when it comes to the decisions that these judges make, and the power that these courts wield? And the answer is that, as I'm sure folks in the room know, all of these judges, trial court judges, appellate court judges, and Ohio Supreme Court justices are elected. In Ohio, we've got an all-elected state, judiciary. They are elected to 6-year terms, and certainly from top to bottom, these judges are making decisions on cases that impact all kinds of rights and liberties we enjoy under the Ohio Constitution. And in the case of the Ohio Supreme Court, they also decide questions regarding the U.S. Constitution too. And whether it is gender affirming care, whether it is other issues affecting the LGBTQ plus community, like kind of general non-discrimination questions, whether it's abortion rights and implementing last year's tremendous victory for abortion rights advocates, a fight that we were a part of to implement the Reproductive Rights Amendment, whether it is gerrymandering. And certainly we saw what happened when the Supreme Court tried to hold the legislature accountable, and the legislature ignored them. Criminal legal reform, education funding, environmental issues, access to firearms. The Ohio Supreme Court, appellate courts, and trial courts are making decisions on all of these issues. And I'll kind of leave it there, because again, I've sort of covered my part here, and certainly Catherine can describe in much more detail how much influence these courts have, and the way that our court system operates. But you can find from organizations like the League of Women Voters, like Common Cause, what trial court and appellate court races are on your ballot this November. And I think we all know that we've got 3 Supreme Court of Ohio races on our ballot, and those are going to be tremendously important in the years to come. Lots at stake for all those issues I mentioned, and lots more that especially the Ohio Supreme Court, they are the last stop for a lot of these questions. So I will leave it there, Christina, and
Thank you. Thank you, Sean. There's one question in the chat box that I thought we could just maybe go ahead and quickly ask before we go over to Catherine. Do you know which judges will make up the panel?
Yes, we do. And I had a note to review that and make sure I remembered the name. I keep forgetting the name of the third judge, and I'm forgetting the name of the third judge, but 2 of them I know for sure. Judge David Leland and Judge Carly Edelstein. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce her last name. Those are 2 of the 3, and I'm just blanking on the third one. I'll see if I can.
Yeah. You'll have a few minutes here then while Catherine presents. Look, that worked out. Hi, Catherine. Welcome.
Hey, everybody. Well, I'm going to start. I have a bunch of slides because I'm a visual learner. And so I'm going to start with this. So I always, when I think about courts, we have to think about like, what do we have as our ideals? What do we envision as justice? And how do we actually get there? And to get there, we have to think about, well, what exactly is the lay of the land right now? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through very briefly kind of federal courts, and then again, briefly state courts. And in this discussion, there's going to be a little bit about, what are some things that we can do to take action? Because we are very close to an election. So there are things that we can prepare to do when it comes to election time. And also there are things that we can do to create greater transparency and accountability at the unelected U.S. Supreme Court. And so I think the thing to always remember as you're thinking about this is to think, there's a federal court and there are the state courts. And at the end of the day, the U.S. Supreme Court makes decisions that impact the state courts. But it's also important to realize that these folks are, although they are appointed, the process for getting them on, as we all know, is incredibly political. It's also important to realize that they have many more cases that want to work their way to the U.S. Supreme Court than actually ever get there. And so as we're thinking about the appointment process, we need to remember kind of all of the dark money and all of the influence that swirled around appointments, And then we need to think about kind of the recent games that went on so that, President Obama missed an appointment completely because of dragging their feet. We can't do this. It's too close to the election. All of the things that led up to creation of the US Supreme Court. And now I think one of the things that's very clear as we think about, what is it, what's our ideal, what is our goal, our value when it comes to fair courts, and how off we are, is that, most Americans feel as if our judicial system is guided not by fairness, not by impartiality, not by the judges being independent thinkers, but instead by ideology. And clearly we can come up with lots of examples where this is in fact the case. I threw a few of them here. Certainly the Trump versus US comes to mind, where President Trump actually essentially has absolute immunity in official acts. And you can imagine how this could go wrong, and not just today, but decades from now. I also think that it's incredibly important to think about like Citizens United decision, which has impacted all of us. And this goes further back in time to 2010. But certainly when the US Supreme Court determined for the first time that corporations, not just humans, had First Amendment rights, they had free speech rights. We have had a court for a long time that has looked at the system, not focused on what is right for individuals, but thinking about things in really odd ways. It's even hard to wrap your head around how is it that essentially they ruled that it was constitutional to move people out that are homeless and have found a place to lay their heads, and that local governments could actually penalize individuals who are sleeping outside. And keep in mind, if I take a nap in a park, it's a lot different. I'm unlikely to be given a citation, or I'm unlikely to be penalized for that activity. They'll just be like, oh, Catherine's taking a nap, let's wake her up. It's just, it's been a series of incredible decisions, and we should be paying close attention to what the US Supreme Court does. I also wanted to highlight, I'm sure you all are very aware of the kind of ethical questions and quandaries and conundrums that have been going on at the SCOTUS level, at the US Supreme Court level. So certainly they do not have recusal standards. They do not have to step aside, even if they have a financial interest in a case, even if their wife is involved in the case in a really particular way. And that's because even though there is a code of conduct that the US Supreme Court justices have, it's really voluntary. So it doesn't have the kind of teeth that is necessary. And certainly over time, I picked Clarence Thomas as an example, but over time, some of these justices have received gifts and trips and have not reported that information, despite the fact that it's in the law. It's a law that was passed by Congress. They are not going to be penalized for breaking the law in a way that any one of us who failed to follow the law would expect to be held accountable. I do want to highlight that, I'm hitting on a lot of different issues, but there are ways to take action. Right now, there is the High Court gift ban, which essentially stops expensive gifts from billionaires. We also need to be thinking about how can we stop dark money, secret trips and lavish gifts. But this is the first step. And I'm going to share this information afterwards so that in your follow-up, you'll also get information about how you can take action on this. This is one step, and it's a step that will move us to the next one. And so as we're thinking about, well, how can we improve the US Supreme Court and how can we improve the system as a whole? There's so much that needs to be done, but just having a gift ban so that US Supreme Court justices are not accountable to billionaires. They are instead more accountable to us. Now we're moving on to the Ohio Supreme Court, and many of you will recognize the giant gavel outside the Ohio Supreme Court. Now, I think the thing that's really important here is what percentage of cases do you think you actually hear in state and local courts compared to federal courts? 95% of the cases. And so even though I just said, hey, it's very important to pay attention to what is happening at the US Supreme Court. And even though we're focused, maybe focused really on education, we do need to have our eyes on both courts, but to be really aware that so many things are happening at the state level. These are the cast of characters that are currently on the Ohio Supreme Court. Now, to be a member of that court, and we are in election season with 3 seats up, to be a member of this court, you do need to be an attorney who's practiced for at least 6 years. So when you think about that, that's actually not long. You can graduate, and by the time you're 30, have actually practiced for 6 years. You need to be a member of the bar, and you need to be younger than 70. Some of you will remember that the former Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor ended up leaving because she basically aged out. The other thing that is also important is the appointments process. The governor appoints a new justice if there is a space available. And that is why we have Joe Deters on this court. Now, the thing to remember about that appointment process is much like when we think about the US Supreme Court, we should be thinking about appointments that happen because, through the president. We should also be thinking about when we go to vote for governor, we should also be thinking, okay, this isn't just about the governor, but also about appointment processes throughout the state system. Now, many of you remember that Joe Deters was a family friend and prosecutor who was appointed to be on the Ohio Supreme Court. He actually wrote the boneless chicken wing decision. And I think it's important to remember that there are important decisions that are made at the Ohio Supreme Court. In this case, this was an issue where the Ohio Supreme Court determined that boneless is a description of a cooking style, not the guarantee of no bones. And one of the ways to think about this is a decision that is pro-business and not pro-consumer. So as we're thinking about, well, what kind of court we want, we do need to be thinking about, well, do we want one that's thinking about the individual people? Are they thinking about, is the court, is the justice that I will vote on, does that justice actually worry about, the food that goes into my children's bodies? Are they concerned about safety? And also to think about the kinds of decisions that impact our pocketbooks. So it's also, I threw this decision in. This is not one that many of you probably spend any time thinking about. But one of the things that is incredibly important is that the Ohio Supreme Court determines the cases related to our electricity rates, any of our utility rates. And it's incredibly important for us to pay attention to those appointments and those decisions as well, because the court can really rein in what the Public Utilities Commission does. And as we know, we've had a variety of problems at the Public Utilities Commission. And it's important, they're an important step in stopping some of the things where consumers are taken advantage of. So I also threw in this kind of upcoming court case, mostly because I'm sure that you're aware of it. I have been part of the Citizens Not Politicians campaign, worked on redistricting reform for a couple decades. I care a lot about what happens when it comes to fair districts and fair elections. So I should tell you, I clearly have a bias in this area. What happened with the Ohio ballot board is the ballot board for issue 1, which is the Citizens Not Politicians Amendment. They ended up writing extremely long language. And the ballot board comes up with the language that voters see when they go to vote. It doesn't change what, the amendment that goes into into the Ohio Constitution doesn't change that. It only changes the language that a voter sees, but it is incredibly long. But of course, that's not the worst of it. It also includes, it's taxpayer funded at the beginning and at the end. And if you think about like latency recency theory, if you see it at the beginning and the end, you're more likely to be like, oh, this is taxpayer funded. So certainly the Secretary of State, who's the head of the ballot board, has put his thumb on the scale there. But on top of it being really long, the language is a bit Orwellian and biased. Essentially, it says that the Citizens Redistricting Commission is required to gerrymander. In other words, the requirement that bans gerrymandering that is in the amendment has been turned on its head. And that is why Citizens Not Politicians has taken this to the Ohio Supreme Court. And so we're expected to hear that ruling fairly soon. But it's important as we think about the makeup and the fairness of the court, all we have to do is think about previous amendments, so issue 1 of November of 2023, and think about how they ruled on that language as we're thinking about, well, who is it that we actually want to have represent us and be there for us at the Ohio Supreme Court. I did want to highlight that just yesterday, 4 business organizations said that they planned to raise $4 million to promote business-friendly judicial candidates, meaning candidates for the Ohio Supreme Court that they see as business-friendly. I also included Leonard Leo. Some of you may have seen the series that, who is Leo? No one talks about Leo. That series, a lot of that series really covered his role in the appointment process to get to the U.S. Supreme Court. But it's also important to realize that there are organizations surrounding Leonard Leo and his fundraising prowess that also impact the Ohio Supreme Court races and Supreme Court races in other states as well. So, before I go, I wanted to give you guys some tools because I think, there's nothing worse than kind of going through, all right, well, there's this problem and there's this problem and not giving you some tools. So one of the things that I really like is a site called judgeforyourselves.com. And what it does is it gives bar ratings of the different candidates. And so I picked Joe Dieters because I mentioned him earlier as an appointment, and who's basically challenging Melody Stewart. The Joe Dieters is challenging Melody Stewart because Melody Stewart is running to re-elected, so it's for 6 years. It's for 6 years, and rather than running to fulfill his term, he's hoping he can knock off Melody Stewart from the court. I think what's interesting here is you can go and see, well, one, he's sometimes the candidate refused to participate. Just yesterday, they updated this to include a rating from the plain dealer, cleveland.com for all of the candidates. But it gives you a sense of like, okay, well, what do the Defense Association think? What to do the Women's Bar think? What about the prosecuting attorneys? It gives you an opportunity to think about, well, what do these folks think? And get you thinking about, well, what would I also like? The other thing that you can do if you're wanting to get to know the candidates who are running for the Ohio Supreme Court is to go to judicialvotescount.org. So this is run by the Ohio State Bar Association. And what they do is it's similar to kind of the voter guide that you would see at the League of Women Voters. They're asked very specific questions. The candidates answer them, and that language is specifically put in. They don't fix for typos or any of those kinds of things. It's put in, and I think there is something that can really be garnered by reading what the candidates say about themselves. I would take some time to look at that because getting to know these folks is another, it's another step. One of the challenges during a presidential year, and certainly a busy US Senate year, is that everybody's focused kind of at the top of the ticket, but the Ohio Supreme Court makes decisions that impact us every single day. And spending some time getting yourself prepared, talking to others about the Supreme Court races is incredibly important. And then I also wanted to add a little bit of information about some of the things that I'm working on. So we have this project, we call it judgetheads.org. And so part of Judge the Ads focuses on what I think of as political ad literacy. It really encourages people to go and look at those disclaimers and then try to think, okay, somebody else is paying for this. If it's paid for by the candidate, you're like, okay, I can go and I can look at those campaign contributions to the candidates on the Secretary of State's site. If it's an organization that I don't recognize, how do I find out about who that is? And so one of our projects at judgetheads.org is that we do what we can to follow the money, including to those dark money organizations. And we did this throughout election 2022. This year, we're teaming up with True North Research so that we can truly understand what we know and what we don't know, and where there are gaps in transparency, so we can advocate for a more transparent system so that we can all follow the money, so that we can better understand who's attempting to influence the court, and to better understand the candidates as well. So, we have on our site as well, we have kind of candidate overviews, including endorsement lists for all of the candidates. That's another way to actually get to know the candidates. And then finally, I wanted to highlight, I'm Catherine Turcer from Common Cause Ohio, but I am on the steering committee for the Ohio Fair Courts Alliance, which is ohiofaircourts.org. And, I just wanted to highlight, it's worth thinking about all of the things that are in place now, but also making sure that we have our eye on what can be better and what it is that we want from the courts, because it is so easy to get discouraged, especially as we think about the criminal justice system and the odd decisions that are made. I think it's important for us to think about, well, what are the next steps? What is our vision? What are the small things we can do today? But also, what is it that we can do together in the long run to improve things? And with that, I am here to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. So much good information in there. Really appreciate it. If Sean wants to come back on screen, while Sean's coming back on screen, we did have a comment in the chat while you were talking, Catherine. Carrie said, as a municipal librarian, I could not take any gift valued at more than $50. That the Supreme Court does not have that restriction is shocking. If you want to comment on that at all.
So one of the things that I find most difficult is, when we were kids, truth, justice, and the American way, right? We were taught, we had this justice system. We were working through some challenges. So I was born in 1965. So that's the year of the Voting Rights Act. And one of the things that we were taught was that our courts were really there for us. They were helping us improve the rights of individuals all over the country, and that things were really improving. And what is incredibly sad right now is that we can't be sure that voting rights won't become candidate rights or won't become politician rights. And so there is a lot of cognitive dissonance. Why is it like a municipal library can't take $50, and yet, Clarence Thomas can accept an RV worth $250,000 plus? It's just hard to wrap your head around that disconnect. This is a site I did not include, but I think it's worth going to check. It's called fixthecourts.org. They have done a lot of research. If you're somebody who's interested in all of the trips and the amounts that should have been reported, it's worth looking at, how essentially, if you go 20 years ago, they were receiving almost nothing. And then it just skyrocketed. And when I say skyrocketed, I'm not saying that that all of the justices are doing this, just some of them. And I think that's the other part. Like, once you start talking about, Clarence Thomas and Justice Alito, you start getting into it's so over the top that it's hard not to get into a conversation about corruption.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look at our own Ohio Supreme Court and the DeWine weighing in on DeWine issues, and that's seems like there would be some ethical concerns there.
Well, this is something that I did not mention. So when Governor DeWine appointed Joe Dieters, he said that he was selecting them because he was a really good guy. He was a family friend. He was very clear in what we would think of as cronyism, right? He was very explicit that he was picking his friend. It's also important to remember that Governor DeWine appointed Joe Dieters' brother to the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. So as his brother makes decisions, right, it goes to the Ohio Supreme Court. So we have Pat DeWine, who's on the Supreme Court, and his dad's the governor. And then we have Joe Dieters, who's on the Supreme Court, that will hear cases that will come from the Public Utilities Commission, and his brother's there. It is, shall we say, incestuous, right? It is really problematic. And so those very cozy relationships don't necessarily lead to really good decision making.
Sean, were you able to find that third judge's name?
Not yet, but
okay.
I will check.
All good. All good. All right, Martina put in the chat box, if Joe Dieters wins this November, will another justice be appointed to fill his current seat? How will that work?
So Joe Dieters did something really unusual. As opposed to running for the seat that he was in, he said, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to run against Melody Stewart, who is already on the Ohio Supreme Court. So that means that there is an open race. And so we're talking, Dan Hawkins is the Republican, Lisa Forbes is the Democrat. So that's an open seat. So everybody who is running this year is running to fill a 6-year term. So the governor will not be involved in an appointment process. I think the thing that as we think about these candidates, it is worth going back in their history. So for Joe Dieters, his chief of staff was a guy named Matt Borges. So in 2004, his chief of staff was a guy named Matt Borges. Matt Borges is now in prison for his activities in the House Bill 6 scandal. In 2004, when Matt Borges was raising money for Joe Dieters' campaign, essentially raising it to give to the Hamilton County Republican Party, and then have that money come to the Dieters campaign, essentially two folks, including a guy named Andrew Foodie. So we're talking 20 years ago, but they actually were charged with extortion of because at that point, Joe Dieters was the treasurer of the state of Ohio. They were charged with extortion. They pleaded guilty to lesser charges. The records were expunged. Certainly didn't change Matt Borges's behavior a lot, 20 years out. But the thing to remember about this is that Joe Dieters left, he left being the state treasurer under a real cloud. He essentially just 20 years ago left because he was never found to be guilty, but certainly his chief of staff was engaged in some misdeeds.
Wow. the amount of information that has to be stored in your brain to pull all these names, it's fascinating. Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm gonna switch gears a bit. I'm gonna ask Sean, I'm gonna ask you a question, and then if I don't see any other questions in the chat, then I've got one more question for both of you, and then we'll kind of wrap up. But Sean, how can Ohioans support trans youth while HB 68 is in effect? Any ideas?
Excellent question. The first thing that I would direct people to is the Trans Ohio Emergency Fund. And I can actually fish that link up really quick. Once I've finished collecting my thoughts. Yeah, I think like the emergency fund is just like the most direct way to support youth and their families, whether they are staying in state and trying to navigate their care, or whether they might be considering moving out of state because they just don't know what comes next. And I know we've seen some folks. Oh yeah, thank you so much, Bettina, for blessing that up. We've seen some folks already have to do that. I think gosh, there was a Capital Journal article recently about a family that moved to New York. So certainly the Trans Ohio Emergency Fund, Equality Ohio, also a great place to support. You know, obviously they've been engaged in the fight, but really, yeah, I would say first and foremost, Trans Ohio Emergency Fund, and I think too, just I always think about the power of like kind of the anecdotal ways that we can all make a difference, whether it is talking to a friend or a family member who maybe is not approaching things in whether they know it or not, that they maybe somebody misgenders somebody, and you can just step in and quickly and respectfully, instead of kind of like, and this is something that I think we've talked about a lot, kind of the different LGBTQ plus advocacy organizations, just like correcting them in a way that is not shutting them down, but kind of helping them to understand that's why that was offensive and disrespectful. You might not have intended that, and that's totally fine. I think just like those kind of, the things that we can do in our everyday lives to help bring others along, and also to support our trans and gender nonconforming family and friends, dropping off a meal if somebody is having a hard time, they're gosh, like the wait list for, even when care is available, the wait list for getting care, whether it's mental health care, or whether it's folks that are going through any kind of part of their transition, just anything that we can do kind of individually to support people. I've tried to get better because I really was not much of a cooking person until like the last few years of my life, but I think that is just such a powerful way to directly support somebody who is going through it. And gosh, just with all of the bills we've seen that everyone in the room knows about, it just kind of feels like for trans folks, you're waking up every day and seeing another headline targeted directly at you and your loved ones. But definitely, yeah, first and foremost, the Trans Ohio Emergency Fund. For those who are in the Dayton area too, Trans Ohio is having their annual symposium this weekend. So another great way to connect directly with them, to plug in directly to their work. Lots of great workshops, another opportunity to support them financially. And I'll think if there are any other resources that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head, I will definitely pass those along too.
The food was a great one. I mean, all of the ideas were great, but like that's one that, it's a simple thing to do, to make something for someone, but it is like that's like a heartfelt thing, like to help somebody out. So that's a great idea. Okay, one more quick question. Elections approaching. We know down ballot voting is so important. What is their messaging, or can you think of anything that Ohioans in general could be saying to people to get them to understand how important it is to vote down ballot, especially for our Supreme Court candidates? So Catherine, I'll start with you, since that's, you spend a lot of time talking about the importance of that.
Well, I think it really comes down to These are things that impact our everyday life. Yes, who is president? That is very, very important. But the Ohio Supreme Court determines everything from our electricity rates to the constitutionality of things. And then I always highlight the consumer rights. That it's important for us to think about, like, well, do you want somebody who's going to be there for you as a consumer, or do you want somebody there to be there for the businesses? And it's not a selling message for everybody, but I highlight, if you highlight, for example, a recent, the recent decision about boneless chicken not actually being boneless, it does help people. They may not be sold on it. They may still think, oh, businesses need protections, but they'll at least think, oh, okay, I see where you're coming from. And I think that's the kind of thing that, like, oh yeah, I saw that. Anything that gets people to, like, start to have a conversation with you about, I can't believe that happened. It also gets them thinking, oh, I actually should really vote on this. I should be thinking about this. And I think it's similar to when we think about the Citizens Not Politicians Amendment. If you're tired of elections being rigged and you're tired of not having the power that we as Ohioans deserve, if you're tired of not participating in meaningful elections, well, then yes, you need to vote yes on issue one. So, like, I think, bringing it back to what people actually care about is very moving and moves folks to action.
Thanks. Thank you. Sean?
Yeah, kind of along similar lines to what Catherine was saying about sort of like trying to make it real for people that, hey, you know, the things that are hitting you in your pocketbook, your family, the things you care about, they're here. they're, for us that are in Columbus, right down the street at the state house and the courthouse, and are in your city council and school board too. Like certainly everyone in this room is just engaged with school boards, talking a lot about school board decisions. And I think, I struggle with, as like I'm 28, and a lot of my friends, if they do pay attention, I well, certainly I'm not the best example because I have a lot of friends who are just as terminally engaged and online as our generation says, and know what's going on. But even those friends, they are like Catherine was saying, they're focused on the White House and Congress and the Supreme Court. And I try so hard to tell them, like, hey, that I worked in that building for 3 years, and like the things that they were talking about doing in that building are the things that are impacting you, and the things that Columbus City Council is working on, and the mayor and the Franklin County prosecutor. And again, just like using Columbus examples, but my whole family is from Cleveland. So same goes for all of those bodies, and not to mention county council up in Cuyahoga County. Just trying to, yeah, like again, Catherine said, personal examples are really important. Like, hey, you might not have seen it, but the legislature passed this crazy bill. And, when I worked there, my old boss might have voted against it and might have, given a floor speech about it. And, until we got more people to start thinking about, like, they passed this bill, it goes into effect, I can't do XYZ thing, or my utility bills are higher now, or whatever the case may be. Until we get people to kind of connect those dots, I think, it's hard to get to cut through that noise of everyone being focused on the federal level, regardless of I think political ideology too. It's just oftentimes people are focused on what they see on the national news, what they see, if like, certainly for those who still get their information from which I'm one of those, but I think people my age are increasingly not, like from the Dispatch or from Cleveland.com. They do great, obviously, as we all know, state house coverage, but I think even in traditional media that there's still, kind of there's a lot of attention devoted to what goes on at the federal level, and we as kind of state level and local advocates kind of have to fight against that, like, inclination to, especially in an election year, in a general election year, to focus on what's going on nationally and remind them, hey, like the one example I forgot to bring up, not at all a comment on the party affiliation or the ideology of a certain judge who made a certain decision on House Bill 68, because that's not what I'm here to do. I was here to talk about the case. that judge won by, I believe, fewer than 500 votes. So if 500 more people were thinking about, you know, these local judicial races in Franklin County, and you know, certainly same goes for Hamilton, Athens, Trumbull, Hardin County, you know, wherever you may be. That's, I think, kind of a powerful example too to give to people, is if this is an issue you care about, and you know, again, not here to single out individual elected officials, but just kind of to tell the story that this decision was made because certain elected officials get reelected and they bring their values. They bring, we have our vote your values branding, and I think it's a salient example that, you know, these folks are bringing their values to that position that the voters just returned to them, or if they're running for an open seat, whatever the case may be. So yeah, trying to personalize it, I think, long story short.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. We are at time, so we are going to end here. But again, thank you both for being here. Thanks for all the wonderful information. Thank you to the attendees. We will be posting this on our website, posting the whole recording on our website. So please feel free to share it out to your friends and networks. And we will see you next month in October, already October, for our next Lunch and Learn. Thank you all. Have a good one. Bye.